Ava had absolutely everything a woman could ever dream of: a lavish, fairy tale wedding on the horizon, a loving, incredibly successful fiancé, and a beautiful, life-changing secret she couldn't wait to finally share with him. She was pregnant. This was supposed to be the absolute happiest moment of her entire life, the beautiful culmination of years of love and careful planning. But just 1 week before the wedding, cruel fate had completely different plans for her. Dylan, the handsome man she deeply, devotedly loved, had completely betrayed her. And worse, her best friend, her maid of honor, was actively part of the betrayal. She easily could have packed her bags, walked away in the middle of the night, and cried herself to sleep. But why on earth would she quietly leave when she could brilliantly, publicly destroy him instead? Stay with us, because this perfect, picture book wedding is about to quickly become the ultimate, devastating reckoning. Ava stood quietly in front of the full-length mirror, running her trembling fingers lightly over the expensive French lace of her stunning wedding dress. The soft, luxurious fabric felt incredibly delicate and fragile under her touch. The intricate, hand-stitched floral patterns, heavily embroidered with hundreds of tiny pearls, beautifully caught the warm, golden glow of the bridal suite's fairy lights. It was absolutely perfect, just exactly like she had always imagined it would be since she was a little girl. She took a slow, deep breath, finally letting the immense reality of the moment sink into her bones. In less than 1 week, she would be walking proudly down the long aisle, marrying the incredible man she loved with all her heart. The happy thought sent a massive rush of comforting warmth straight through her chest, making her stomach flutter with excited butterflies. Dylan, her Dylan. He wasn't just her fiancé, he was her absolute best friend, her safe place in a chaotic world. The strong, capable man she had built her entire future around. They had been through so much together over the years, and now they were finally, officially reaching the magical moment she had dreamed of for so long. She could already picture it perfectly in her mind. His incredibly handsome smile as she walked slowly toward him, the warm, reassuring way his strong hands would feel when he finally took hers at the altar, the deep, unwavering promise in his dark eyes as he confidently said, "I do." She smiled warmly to herself in the mirror, placing a gentle hand over her flat stomach. And soon, there will be 3 of us. The profound realization sent a massive wave of pure happiness coursing through her body. She had only just found out she was pregnant 2 days ago and had kept it a strict, wonderful secret, wanting desperately to surprise Dylan in the most special, romantic way possible. She had imagined the reveal so many times in her head. Maybe she would tell him on their romantic honeymoon in Italy. Maybe she would whisper it the night after the wedding, curled up safely together in their massive bed. He would laugh his deep, booming laugh, pull her tightly into his arms, press his warm forehead against hers, and whisper something incredibly sweet like, "We're really going to be parents? Really?" His voice would be so soft, so completely amazed. He had always talked enthusiastically about wanting kids someday. This baby was the ultimate, physical proof of their deep love, a beautiful new beginning for their family. Everything in her life was finally falling perfectly into place. A sharp, sudden knock on the bedroom door pulled her abruptly out of her happy thoughts. "Ava!" Brooke's bright, bubbly voice rang loudly through the room right before she stepped confidently inside. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was tucked elegantly into a loose, messy updo, and she was wearing one of the expensive, silky pink robes Ava had generously gifted the entire bridal party. "Oh my God! You look absolutely stunning." Ava turned to her, beaming brightly. "You really think so? Are you kidding me?" Brooke walked over, gently touching the delicate, pearl embroidery of the heavy dress. "Dylan is going to completely lose his mind when he finally sees you in this." Ava let out a soft, happy laugh, feeling her cheeks warm with a deep blush. "I really hope so." "He definitely should," Brooke smirked, adjusting a piece of lace on Ava's shoulder. Not every guy gets incredibly lucky enough to marry someone who actually looks like a literal dream. Ava rolled her eyes playfully at the compliment. But she absolutely couldn't hide the way her heart swelled massively at the exciting thought of Dylan seeing her for the very first time tomorrow. Brooke flopped heavily onto the plush, king-sized bed. "Are you getting nervous?" "A little bit," Ava admitted honestly, walking over and sitting gently beside her best friend. "Not nervous about marrying Dylan, of course. Just, I don't know, the massive wedding itself. I guess. What if I clumsily trip walking down the aisle in these heels? What if I stumble and say something completely stupid during my vows?" Brooke waved her hand dismissively. "Please. Even if you completely faceplant, Dylan will still be entirely obsessed with you." Ava smiled, feeling deeply reassured for a moment. They just sat there together, a comfortable, familiar silence settling warmly between them. Brooke had been her absolute best friend for years. She was the one loyal person who had been steadfastly by her side through absolutely everything: terrible heartbreaks, stressful career struggles, late-night emotional breakdowns over pints of ice cream. She was exactly like a sister to her, and tomorrow, she would stand proudly beside Ava at the altar as her maid of honor. "I still can't believe it's finally happening," Ava murmured softly, looking down at the massive, sparkling diamond ring sitting heavily on her finger. "I know," Brooke nudged her playfully with her shoulder. "It honestly feels like just yesterday when we were sitting on the floor in your tiny, gross apartment, drinking cheap wine out of plastic cups and laughing about how absolutely none of the loser guys you dated were worth your time." Ava laughed loudly at the funny memory. "And now look at me. I'm marrying the absolute man of my dreams." Brooke nodded in agreement, but for a fraction of a second, something dark and unreadable flickered quickly across her beautiful face, too quick for Ava to truly catch or understand. Before she could think much of it, Brooke spoke up again. "You really love him, don't you?" Ava didn't even hesitate for a second. "With absolutely everything in me." And she genuinely meant it. Dylan wasn't a completely perfect man, but he was hers. He had always been incredibly ambitious, always intensely focused on climbing the corporate ladder and building his career. But she had absolutely never, ever doubted his love for her. He was incredibly charming, wildly successful, and confident in a powerful way that drew people into his orbit effortlessly. Sure, he could be a little distracted sometimes when work got stressful. And maybe he wasn't the most emotionally expressive or vulnerable person in the world, but he was fiercely driven. He had impressively built his wealth and his company entirely from the ground up, and she deeply admired that fierce work ethic about him. Ava knew, deep down in her soul, that Dylan loved her. She knew it. Didn't she? A tiny, uncomfortable, nagging thought suddenly crept into the back of her mind, but she quickly and forcefully pushed it away. Of course he loved her. He had proposed to her in the most incredibly beautiful, romantic way imaginable. A completely private, catered rooftop dinner overlooking the glittering city. Thousands of fairy lights twinkling magically above them. A string quartet playing soft music in the background. He had held her shaking hands tightly, looked deeply and sincerely into her eyes, and said absolutely all the right words. "I literally can't imagine my life without you, Ava. Please, marry me." He had made her feel so incredibly special, so deeply loved, so intentionally chosen. That was absolutely all that mattered. "Do you ever think about what life will really be like after?" Brooke asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ava tilted her head, slightly confused. "After what?" "The wedding," Brooke said, leaning back against the fluffy pillows, staring up at the ceiling like she was analyzing a complex puzzle. "Like, once the whole fairy tale party is over, when it's just boring, normal, everyday life again, do you think things between you two will change?" Ava considered the strange question for a moment. "I mean, probably, but in a good way, right? We'll grow older together, Figure things out as a team. Maybe we'll finally buy a house in the suburbs. Start a family. Her hand instinctively, protectively went to rest on her stomach again. A heavy second passed before Brooke finally reached out and took her hand, squeezing it lightly. I really am happy for you, Ava. And she sounded exactly like she genuinely meant it. The slightly weird moment passed quickly and Brooke stood up, stretching her arms. All right, bride-to-be. You really should try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's a massive day for you. Ava nodded, standing up with her. Yeah, it really is. Brooke hugged her tightly before heading toward the bedroom door. Sweet dreams, Ava. As the heavy door clicked shut softly behind her, Ava exhaled a deep, happy breath, turning back to the mirror. She stared at her glowing reflection for a long, quiet moment, her fingers brushing softly over the beautiful bodice of her dress. Tomorrow, she would officially become Mrs. Dylan Carter, and she had never, ever felt more ready for anything in her entire life. Later that night, Ava lay wide awake in the massive bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, distant hum of the busy city beyond the penthouse windows. Sleep absolutely wouldn't come to her. Her mind was entirely too full, spinning endlessly with happy thoughts of tomorrow. She thought of the beautiful vows she would say, of the perfect life she was about to formally start. She reached over for her phone on the nightstand, briefly considering texting Dylan. But what would she even say to him? I can't sleep, are you awake? It felt silly and childish. He was probably already fast asleep in his office, completely exhausted from all the endless, stressful wedding preparations and his bachelor party. She sighed heavily, sitting up in the dark. Maybe getting some fresh, cool air on the balcony would help clear her racing head. Slipping quietly out of the warm bed, she grabbed her silk robe and wrapped it tightly around her before stepping softly out of the bedroom. The massive apartment was completely dark, except for the dim, ambient glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. As she padded quietly barefoot across the hardwood floor toward the balcony, she froze in her tracks. Laughter. Deep, hushed, masculine laughter coming directly from Dylan's home office down the hall. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he actually still awake working? Was he on a late-night phone call? No, the sound was entirely too clear and distinct. Someone else was physically in there with him. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping silently closer down the hall. The heavy oak door wasn't fully shut, just slightly ajar, leaving a crack just wide enough for her to clearly see the warm, golden glow of the desk lamp spilling out into the dark hallway. Dylan's confident, relaxed voice drifted out first. Man, I honestly still can't even believe I'm actually going through with this tomorrow. Ava frowned deeply in the darkness, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of the door frame. Then Eric's voice answered, Dylan's obnoxious best friend and best man. I really thought you'd change your mind and back out before now. Bro, what happened to all that big talk about marriage being a total cage for a man? Dylan chuckled loudly, the sound so incredibly casual, so relaxed. Ava's absolutely perfect for the role, Eric. She's sweet, she's devoted. And best of all, she is completely, utterly clueless. Ava's stomach twisted violently into a sickening knot. Eric laughed, the clinking of ice in a glass echoing in the room. Damn, so you're really going to officially lock this down? Of course I am, Dylan said, and Ava could literally hear the arrogant smirk in his voice. I mean, look at her. She's beautiful. She's smart enough to keep things interesting at dinner parties. But she's definitely not smart enough to ever question my decisions. She is a perfect trophy wife. The exact kind of innocent woman that makes me look incredibly good to the conservative board members. Something freezing cold and incredibly sharp lodged itself deeply in Ava's chest. Trophy wife. Completely clueless. Her breathing slowed to a halt, her pulse hammering so hard and so fast she could loudly hear it rushing in her ears. Eric took a slow, loud sip of his drink. And she really has absolutely no idea about Brooke? Ava's entire body went completely, terrifyingly cold. She stopped breathing altogether. There was a long, agonizing beat of silence in the office. Then, Dylan exhaled a dark, arrogant laugh. Please, if she ever found out the truth, she'd break completely in half like a fragile porcelain doll. She literally worships the ground I walk on. Eric, keeping it a secret from her has been almost too easy. Ava gripped the wooden door frame tighter, her manicured nails digging painfully into the painted wood. Eric let out a low, impressed whistle. So, exactly how long has it been going on between you two? Dylan casually swirled his expensive whiskey, watching the ice clink against the crystal glass. A few months now. It was honestly just supposed to be a fun, one-time thing. You know, just some drinks, some late-night fun to blow off steam. But Brooke, he let out a dark, hungry chuckle. Man, she is incredibly addictive. Ava bit the soft inside of her cheek, so incredibly hard, she instantly tasted metallic blood in her mouth. Brooke, her best friend, the very woman who had, just a few short hours ago, sat on her bed, smiled warmly at her, held her hands, and told her how incredibly happy she was for her. The sheer, massive scale of the betrayal sank in, heavy, toxic, and utterly suffocating. But Dylan wasn't done destroying her life yet. He leaned back comfortably in his leather office chair. Stretching his arms like this was just another casual, boring conversation about the weather. Right after the wedding, I'll easily get Ava to sign a post-nup agreement. I'll manipulate her and make her think it's just for us. Something about ensuring our future financial security. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. He grinned a wicked grin. And then, when I eventually get bored of playing house with her, I'll leave her with nothing and just move on to someone new. Eric snorted loudly, laughing. Damn. Man. That is ice cold. Dylan shrugged his broad shoulders dismissively. Marriage is just another corporate business deal. Eric. And Ava? She's just a temporary, low-risk investment. Ava barely made it back to the safety of her dark bedroom before the violent sobs completely took over her body. As soon as the bedroom door clicked shut silently behind her, her shaking legs gave out completely, and she collapsed heavily onto the floor. Her back pressed hard against the cold wood of the door, her trembling hands flying up to cover her mouth, desperately trying to silence the loud, ragged gasps escaping her throat. Her entire body shook violently. The crushing weight of what she had just heard was absolutely suffocating. Dylan, the man she had deeply, fiercely loved, implicitly trusted, and given absolutely everything to. He had callously played her for an absolute fool from the very beginning. And Brooke, the woman she had loved and called her sister, her closest confidant in the world, had been sleeping with him behind her back, laughing at her all along. Ava's hands shook uncontrollably as she crawled to the bathroom and gripped the edges of the cold porcelain sink. Trophy wife. Completely clueless. She stared at her pale, tear-streaked face in the mirror and thought of every single moment she had spent with him. Every time she had laughed at his jokes, kissed him, held onto him tightly like he was her ultimate safe place in the world. Every single time she had faithfully defended him to her family when he came home late smelling like alcohol, brushed off his cold distance as just work stress, and told herself that the deep love they shared was real and enduring. She thought about the countless nights Brooke had stayed over at the apartment, the time she had looked Ava dead in the eye, smiling, and told her how incredibly lucky she was to have a successful, handsome man like Dylan. It all felt completely unreal. It felt exactly like some cruel, twisted, hidden camera joke she'd wake up from at any second. But no matter how many times she desperately begged the universe to rewind time, to magically take her back to the peaceful moment before she walked past that office door, absolutely nothing changed. The horrific reality remained. Her stomach twisted painfully, hot nausea creeping rapidly up her throat again. But this time, she fiercely forced herself to swallow it down. She absolutely couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. She curled in tightly on herself on the bathroom floor, her arms wrapping protectively and fiercely around her flat stomach. Their child. Her child. A fresh, massive wave of complex emotions surged violently through her. Blinding anger, paralyzing fear, and crushing heartbreak, all tangled together in a massive, suffocating knot. What kind of monster did this? What kind of sociopathic father could smile at her, kiss her forehead, talk excitedly about their future family, all while maliciously planning to betray and discard her the exact moment she was legally bound to him? And Brooke, how many hundreds of times had she sat right across from Ava, sipping expensive wine, laughing, and telling her how incredibly excited she was for the wedding? How many times had she warmly reassured Ava that Dylan truly loved her? Had she been wickedly laughing behind her back this entire time? Had she whispered to Dylan in bed after every phone call, mocking Ava for being so incredibly, pathetically naive? Ava clenched her jaw so tight her teeth ached, aggressively wiping her wet, flushed cheeks with the rough back of her hand. Her first instinct was flight. She should leave immediately, pack a single bag, grab her passport, and completely disappear into the night before the sun even rises. She had more than enough money saved up in her own private account. She could easily buy a last-minute, one-way flight to Europe, vanish into a beautiful new city, and raise her baby entirely on her own. But then, Dylan's arrogant, mocking voice echoed loudly in her mind. If she ever found out, she'd break like a fragile porcelain doll. Porcelain doll. Fragile. Weak. Breakable. Her entire body tensed with fury. Her fingers dug painfully into the delicate silk of her robe. Her breathing came out incredibly slow and heavily measured. No, she absolutely wouldn't break for him. She wouldn't run away like some pathetic, scorned, weeping woman crying alone in a cheap hotel room in a city where absolutely no one knew her name. She absolutely wouldn't give Dylan the satisfaction of that easy victory. She would give him a wedding. She would generously give him the absolute perfect, beautiful, storybook ceremony he arrogantly thought he was getting. She would give him absolutely everything he wanted. And then, she would brilliantly, publicly burn his entire world to the ground in front of everyone he cared about. Her manicured nails pressed into her palms hard enough to draw blood. He had maliciously used her, lied to her face for months, and deeply humiliated her behind her back. Now it was her turn to play the game. Her brilliant mind raced, aggressively working through absolutely every possibility, every single strategic move she could make. She would desperately need help. Someone on the inside who intimately knew Dylan. Someone who wasn't already bought and paid for in his pocket. Only one name came to mind. Jesse, Dylan's quiet, observant younger brother. The absolute only person in his toxic family who had ever truly seen her, respected her, and treated her like a human being. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her phone as she frantically scrolled through her long contact list. She had never, ever called him this late at night before. She had never actually needed to. But tonight, absolutely everything was different. The rules had changed. Her thumb hovered nervously over his name on the screen for a second before she forced herself to press call. The line rang once. Twice. Then, a deep, groggy voice answered. Ava? His tone shifted rapidly from sleepy to intensely concerned almost instantly. What's wrong? Are you okay? She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. The heavy, painful lump in her throat was back, thick and suffocating, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she wouldn't be able to speak at all without breaking down again. Jesse must have intuitively sensed her panic. Hey, he said. his voice dropping softer. More grounding now. Take a deep breath. Just talk to me. Ava. Ava squeezed her eyes shut, pressing a cold hand to her burning forehead. Her voice, when it finally came out, was barely above a raspy whisper. I desperately need to see you, Jesse. Right now. Please. There was a very brief pause on the line. Where are you? I'll be there in 10 minutes. There was absolutely no hesitation, no annoying questions. Just a quiet, absolute certainty that he would show up for her. Ava slowly pulled the phone away from her ear, staring blankly down at the glowing screen until the call finally disconnected. 10 minutes. Her hand still trembled slightly, but this time it absolutely wasn't from grief or heartbreak. It was from something much colder, much sharper, and far more dangerous. She had officially made her decision. The war had begun. The all-night diner was nearly empty at this ungodly hour, except for a few exhausted, late-night stragglers hunched over their hot drinks, entirely lost in their own quiet worlds. The air smelled heavily of fresh, burnt coffee and something sweet, but Ava barely noticed her surroundings. She sat rigidly in the cracked vinyl corner booth, her cold hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug of tea that had long gone freezing cold. Her leg bounced nervously under the table. She was desperately trying to stay calm, to force herself to breathe evenly, to keep herself completely together. But the exact moment she saw Jesse walk hurriedly through the glass door, everything carefully constructed inside her cracked just a little bit more. He looked exactly like he had thrown on whatever clean clothes he could find in the dark jeans. A plain, wrinkled t-shirt and a heavy hoodie pulled up over his head against the chill. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a heavy exhaustion still clinging to his handsome face. But the second his intense eyes found hers across the diner, all of that sleepiness faded into sharp focus. Ava had always thought that Jesse and Dylan were absolutely nothing alike, despite being blood brothers. Where Dylan was incredibly polished, sharp-edged fake, and always highly calculated in his movements, Jesse possessed a completely different kind of presence. He was steady, incredibly calm, and grounded, like a quiet storm that hadn't quite decided if it wanted to rage or not yet. Right now, looking at her, he looked like he was teetering dangerously on the edge of a rage. He slid smoothly into the booth across from her, his intense gaze immediately scanning her pale face, taking in her red-rimmed, swollen eyes, and the way her fingers trembled slightly as she put her heavy cup down. "Tell me absolutely everything," he said, his voice incredibly low but demanding. Ava swallowed hard. She hadn't allowed herself to cry a single tear since violently locking herself in her bathroom earlier. She had fiercely told herself she wouldn't let another tear fall for a monster like Dylan Carter. But now, sitting safely across from Jesse, someone who actually cared about her, someone who wasn't actively feeding her lies, something deep inside her wavered and threatened to break. She exhaled a long, incredibly shaky breath, gripping the hard edge of the table as she painfully forced the terrible words out. "I heard him tonight," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dylan. He was talking to Eric in his office." Jesse's strong jaw tightened instantly. His large hands curled into tight fists on the tabletop. Ava felt her throat tighten painfully. "He doesn't love me, Jesse," she said quietly, staring at her hands. "He never did. I was just a convenient trophy to him, a cheap way to boost his corporate image." She looked down at her lap, her voice cracking even more. "And Brooke," she let out a bitter, shaky, heartbroken laugh. "It's been her this whole entire time. My best friend. He arrogantly bragged about it to Eric like it was some kind of hilarious joke." Jesse's handsome expression darkened into pure, lethal fury. Ava's fingers dug fiercely into her palms, her nails pressing deep into her skin. "And after the wedding," her voice lowered to a freezing whisper, "he planned to manipulate me to make me sign a postnup. Then, when he inevitably got bored of me, He was going to leave me with absolutely nothing. Jesse sucked in a sharp, furious breath, leaning heavily back in his seat. His large fists clenched and unclenched rapidly, exactly like he was fiercely struggling to keep himself from standing up and punching a hole in the wall. When he finally spoke, his deep voice was incredibly tight with restrained, violent anger. "I always knew Dylan was a selfish, arrogant jerk," he muttered, shaking his head in disgust. "But this is something entirely else. This is evil." He exhaled slowly, desperately trying to level his breathing. "And Brooke? Are you absolutely sure about her?" Ava let out a hollow, empty laugh. "Oh, he made it pretty damn clear on the recording. Apparently she's addictive." The word tasted like sour battery acid in her mouth. Jesse muttered something foul under his breath, something she didn't quite catch, but it definitely sounded like a vicious curse. He looked away out the window for a second, running a stressed hand through his dark hair, trying hard to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Then, when his intense eyes finally met hers again, his angry expression softened just slightly with deep empathy. "What are you going to do about this?" he asked quietly, leaning forward. Ava inhaled deeply, finding her center. "I initially thought about running. Just packing a bag and leaving. Leaving the state before the wedding. Completely disappearing from his life." Jessie studied her face carefully. But then I thought about exactly how he sees me," she said, her voice growing noticeably steadier, colder now. "A fragile porcelain doll. Something incredibly weak. Something easily breakable. He honestly thinks I'll completely shatter into pieces the second I find out the truth." Jessie's jaw twitched in anger. Ava sat up much straighter in the booth, the roaring fire inside her burning significantly stronger now. "I am absolutely not running away. Jesse, I'm not letting him win this game. I want to make him pay for this. I want him to feel exactly what it's like to have his entire, perfect world spectacularly collapse right in front of him." A slow, incredibly dark smirk tugged at the corner of Jesse's lips, but his dark eyes remained deadly serious. "So, you want total revenge?" Ava didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Yes." Jesse nodded slowly, tapping his long fingers thoughtfully against the table as he processed her bold words. He didn't try to talk her out of it for a second. He didn't feed her some pathetic, toxic positivity nonsense about how revenge wasn't worth it, or how she should be the bigger person and walk away. Instead, he leaned aggressively forward, resting his muscular arms on the table, his voice dropping incredibly low. "Then let's make it completely, utterly count." Ava blinked in surprise. You're actually helping me do this." Jesse's expression hardened into granite. "Of course I am. Ava, you really think I'm going to just stand by and let him get away with destroying you like this?" He scoffed loudly. He spent his entire miserable life stepping on innocent people to get ahead, arrogantly thinking he's completely untouchable. But absolutely not this time. A strange, overwhelming mix of intense relief and profound gratitude filled Ava's chest. She hadn't fully realized just how badly she desperately needed someone in her corner to believe in her, to believe that she wasn't crazy or vindictive for wanting to completely destroy the monster who had callously destroyed her first. Jesse aggressively cracked his knuckles, his dark eyes sharp with lethal determination. "Tell me exactly what you're thinking. What's the plan?" Ava took a deep, steadying breath. "We let him arrogantly believe absolutely nothing is wrong," she said. "I act slightly hurt, but totally forgiving, like a naive woman who loves him way too much to ever walk away. I let him confidently think I'm still completely under his spell." Jesse nodded, tracking her logic. "And while he's busy being a smug bastard, I will quietly get the hard evidence. Text messages, deleted photos, security footage, whatever undeniable proof I can find. We make absolutely sure there's no possible way he can smooth-talk his way out of it. Ava met his intense gaze, her heart pounding with adrenaline. And then, on the actual wedding day, we spectacularly expose him in front of absolutely everyone. Jesse leaned back slightly in the booth, a slow, dangerous grin fully forming on his face. Now that sounds like an incredible plan. Ava exhaled a long breath, her tense fingers finally unclenching for the very first time since hearing Dylan's cruel voice through that office door. She felt something entirely other than agonizing pain. She felt incredibly, undeniably powerful. Jesse reached for his black coffee, taking a slow sip before setting it down with a smirk. This is going to be incredibly fun to watch. Ava watched him closely, something new and unexpected shifting deep inside her chest. She had always liked Jesse as a friend, but she had never, ever seen him exactly like this before. Intensely focused, completely unwavering, and standing so firmly and protectively by her side. Dylan had massively underestimated her strength, and that would undoubtedly be his absolute greatest, fatal mistake. Ava woke up the very next morning feeling entirely different. Not lighter, and definitely not at peace, but incredibly, highly controlled. Every single part of her shattered soul felt like it had been meticulously stitched back together overnight, carefully pieced into something steady, lethal, and completely unshakable. The agonizing hurt was still there, buried deep in her bones, but she absolutely refused to let it show on her face. Not yet. Ava turned over in the massive bed, staring blankly at the empty space beside her. Dylan had stayed out all night at his wild bachelor party, or so he claimed via a brief text. Before last night, she might have foolishly believed him without a second thought. She would have innocently pictured him surrounded by his loud friends, laughing, drinking beers, and happily counting down the hours until she finally became his wife. No. She knew infinitely better. She took a slow, deep breath before forcing herself out of bed. She had a difficult, Oscar-worthy role to play today. By the time Dylan finally came stumbling home that late afternoon, Ava was standing in the bright kitchen, carefully and meticulously arranging an expensive charcuterie board for the two of them. She could clearly hear his heavy footsteps as he entered the penthouse, his confident, arrogant stride carrying him straight toward her. "Hey, beautiful," he said smoothly, sliding a possessive arm around her waist from behind, pressing a fake, lingering kiss to the side of her neck. Ava's body stilled for a fraction of a terrified second before she tilted her head and offered him a small, perfectly practiced smile. "Hey," she said softly, acting exactly as if she had been eagerly waiting for his return all day. Dylan grinned his arrogant grin, squeezing her hip. "Miss me while I was gone?" Her stomach turned violently in disgust, but she forced a quiet, adoring laugh, leaning back into his chest just enough to make it look highly convincing. "Of course I did. Did you have fun last night with the guys?" Dylan walked over to the stainless steel fridge, grabbing a bottle of cold water. "Yeah, it was pretty wild. Eric got so incredibly drunk I honestly thought we were going to have to physically carry him home." Ava nodded, turning her attention back to the wooden board, carefully slicing a wedge of brie cheese. Her hands were perfectly, terrifyingly steady. "Sounds like a really good time." Dylan twisted the plastic cap off his water bottle and took a long sip, watching her closely like a hawk. "Are you okay?" Ava blinked innocently, glancing up at him. "What do you mean?" Dylan studied her face for a long moment, like he was desperately trying to read something hidden beneath the surface. "I don't know. You just seem a little bit different today." Ava's red lips curled into a small, shy smile. "I'm officially getting married tomorrow. Dylan, I'm pretty sure that's more than enough stress to make any woman act a little bit different." Dylan chuckled, entirely buying the excuse. He walked up behind her again, his large hands sliding possessively up her bare arms. "Cold feet. Babe." She turned slowly in his hold, looking up into his dark eyes. Her expression was incredibly soft, almost shy. Maybe a little bit. Not about you, of course. Just everything else. The massive wedding. All the demanding guests, the center of attention. It's a lot of pressure. Dylan relaxed instantly, his ego completely stroked. His grip on her loosened as he smirked confidently. Babe, you're going to be absolutely fine. The second you walk down that long aisle and see me, absolutely none of that other stuff is going to matter. Ava exhaled softly, nodding her head exactly like he had just said the exact perfect thing she desperately needed to hear, to feel safe. You're so right, Dylan. Dylan leaned in, kissing her forehead. I always am. Ava forcefully forced herself to completely melt into his toxic touch, to let her rigid body relax against him. It was a high-stakes game of absolute control now, and she absolutely refused to lose to him. The grueling days leading up to the massive wedding were absolutely nothing short of a carefully choreographed, theatrical performance. Ava played her naive role flawlessly. She smiled brightly when Dylan touched her, she laughed loudly at his terrible jokes, and she perfectly pretended to be the hopelessly love-struck fiancé she had once genuinely been. But beneath it all, Ava's mind was incredibly sharp, cold, and intensely focused on his destruction. He entirely bought the act at first. But Dylan was a sharp, calculating man, and as much as he absolutely loved thinking he had her completely wrapped around his little finger, he wasn't entirely stupid. By the second day, the subtle shift in his arrogant behavior was noticeable. He cast longer, suspicious glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. His heavy arm lingered around her waist just a second too long, testing her reactions. His voice was slightly more careful and measured when he spoke to her. You're being really quiet today, he said suddenly one evening. Ava glanced up from her bridal magazine, feigning complete confusion. Dylan's dark eyes were locked entirely on her now, his expression completely unreadable. You've been acting very different these past couple of days. Ava smiled her sweetest smile, slowly closing the glossy magazine. Have I? Dylan tilted his head slightly, studying her like a bug under a microscope. Yeah, not in a bad way necessarily. Just, something feels slightly off between us. She let out a small, breathy, exhausted laugh, shaking her head. Dylan, I swear to God, if I hear one more person ask me about wedding jitters, I'm going to absolutely lose my mind. Dylan smirked slightly, reaching out for her hand. Hey, I get it. It's a massive deal. You're about to legally be Mrs. Carter. Ava forcefully forced herself to blush, looking down shyly at their intertwined fingers. Dylan brushed a thumb gently over her knuckles. You're definitely not having any second thoughts about us, right? Ava's chest tightened painfully with rage, but her loving expression didn't falter for a microsecond. Instead, she squeezed his hand lightly, looking up at him with exactly the right, calculated amount of vulnerability in her eyes. Of course not, Dylan. Dylan held her intense gaze for a second longer, exactly as if he were desperately searching for a lie beneath the surface. Then finally his ego won out. He exhaled a breath, grinning arrogantly. Good, because once you say I do tomorrow, there is absolutely no backing out for you. Ava smiled brightly back at him. If only he knew. And Jesse was absolutely always there. He existed quietly just on the edges of it all. Incredibly steady and totally unwavering in his support. They met in absolute secret, far away from the prying eyes of Dylan and his toxic social circle. Late-night encrypted phone calls, hushed, intense conversations in hidden corners of restaurants, and secretive, exchanged glances across crowded pre-wedding events. It was incredibly strange how quickly she had come to deeply rely on him. How his mere, quiet presence seemed to totally ground her when absolutely everything else in her life felt like it was violently spinning out of control. Tonight was absolutely no different. They sat across from each other in a quiet, obscure cafe located far from the main streets, where absolutely no one would recognize them. Ava stirred her chamomile tea absent-mindedly, silently watching the way Jesse's long fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the wooden table. He was deep in thought. He had that specific look again, the one where his strong jaw was clenched just slightly, the one where she could easily tell he was holding something heavy back. She sighed softly. "You really don't have to do this. You know." Jesse's dark eyes lifted to meet hers instantly. "Do what? Help you get justice?" She set her silver spoon down, tilting her head. "You're risking an awful lot of family drama by getting involved in this. Dylan is your blood brother. Jesse." Jesse scoffed loudly, shaking his head in deep disgust. "Please don't remind me of that unfortunate fact." Ava gave him a small, sad smile. "Still." Jesse leaned back heavily in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Ava, let's be entirely honest here. Did you really think I'd just sit back quietly and watch him do something this evil to you?" She blinked, completely caught off guard by the raw intensity in his deep voice. He ran a frustrated hand through his dark hair, deep frustration flickering across his handsome face. "I've spent years, my entire life, watching Dylan ruthlessly manipulate innocent people, watching him use them like they're absolutely nothing but stepping stones, and I hated every second of it. But this," he gestured pointedly between them, "what he deliberately did to you, it's entirely different." Ava swallowed hard, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightness in her chest. "Why is it different?" Jesse hesitated for only a fraction of a second before leaning in close, his voice incredibly soft and vulnerable now. "Because you absolutely didn't deserve this, Ava." Something in the air between them violently shifted for a moment. Neither of them spoke a word. The entire world outside the cafe windows moved on without them, cars splashing by, distant laughter echoing from another table, the soft, rhythmic hum of the espresso machines. But right here, in this small booth between them, everything felt incredibly, breathlessly still. Ava dropped her gaze nervously to her hands. "I don't even really know who I am anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a broken whisper. "Absolutely everything I believed in, everything I thought was real, it was all just a sick lie." Jesse didn't say anything right away. Then, after a long pause, he reached across the table. His warm fingers brushed gently against hers. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't demanding in any way. It was just there. A quiet, steadfast presence offering something beautiful she wasn't quite sure she deserved right now. She looked up at him, her breath catching slightly in her throat. "You're still exactly you, Ava," Jesse said, his voice a steady anchor. "You're just finally seeing things clearly for the first time." Ava stared deeply into his eyes, her wounded heart pounding for complex reasons she absolutely didn't want to name yet. For the very first time in days, she wasn't drowning in grief. She wasn't frantically gasping for air, struggling desperately to keep herself from falling completely apart. She was just sitting here with him, and she felt safe. The profound thought startled her. She pulled her hand back quickly, as if she had been burned by fire, tucking it safely into her lap. "This really isn't the right time for this, is it?" Jesse studied her face for a long, quiet moment before exhaling a quiet, understanding laugh and shaking his head. "No, it's really not." Ava forced a tight smile, desperately ignoring the strange, warm feeling twisting happily inside her. "Good, because I absolutely cannot afford to be distracted from the plan right now." Jesse leaned back, watching her incredibly carefully. "I get it." She had fully expected him to say something else, maybe tease her lightly to break the tension, maybe push just a little bit harder to see how she felt. But he didn't. He just sat there patiently, letting the awkward silence settle naturally, letting her be the one to decide to move past it. And somehow, his absolute respect for her boundaries made her feelings for him even stronger. She cleared her throat awkwardly, shifting in her seat. So, what's next on the agenda? Jesse exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly as he graciously let the intense moment slip away. We stick exactly to the plan. Ava nodded firmly, forcing herself to focus entirely on the mission. Right. The master plan. The ultimate revenge. Dylan. She had to constantly remember exactly why she was sitting here, why any of this nightmare was happening. But as she walked out of that cozy cafe later that night, the freezing cold air biting sharply against her skin, she absolutely couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that something fundamental between her and Jesse had permanently changed. And that realization scared her more than anything else. The massive, historic cathedral stood exactly like a monument to absolute perfection. It was beautifully bathed in soft, golden, romantic light. Its towering, intricate stained glass windows cast brilliant, colorful reflections across the highly polished, white marble floor. The air inside was incredibly thick with excited anticipation, and loud murmurs of admiration passed constantly between the hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. Absolutely everything was flawless. The thousands of imported ivory roses lining the long aisle, the soft, swelling melody of the hired string quartet, the crisp, expensive scent of designer cologne and freshly cut flowers. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious, flashy wedding Dylan had always wanted, grand, luxurious, and a massive public spectacle of his wealth. And there he stood, right at the ornate altar, looking absolutely every bit the picture of a victorious, triumphant groom. His custom tuxedo was perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders, his dark hair styled with just the exact right amount of effortlessness, and his signature, arrogant smirk was tugging at the corner of his lips. He was completely at ease. He was happily shaking hands with a few high-profile corporate guests in the front row, murmuring small, polite pleasantries, fully knowing that all eyes in the room were enviously on him. He looked exactly like a powerful man who had absolutely everything in the world. He had absolutely no idea that he was about to spectacularly lose everything. Ava stood quietly just outside the heavy cathedral doors, entirely hidden from view. Her shaking fingers were wrapped incredibly tightly around the stems of her expensive bridal bouquet. Her pulse was surprisingly steady, her breathing perfectly even, but right beneath the calm surface, something wildly electric crackled in her veins. She could clearly hear the soft rustling of expensive fabric as the bridesmaids nervously adjusted their dresses. Brooke stood just a few short feet away, her back turned to Ava. Ava didn't look at her. She couldn't stomach it. She focused entirely on the heavy weight of her wedding gown instead. The intricate, expensive lace, the delicate, tiny pearl buttons running down her spine, the soft, flowing layers of tulle trailing beautifully behind her. Every single detail had been chosen incredibly carefully, specifically designed to make this very moment perfect. And it was completely perfect. Just not in the exact way Dylan had so arrogantly planned. A frantic wedding planner peeked her head in, frantically signaling that it was finally time. The massive doors were about to open. The entire world was about to violently shift on its axis. Ava inhaled deeply, lifting her chin high. A slow, almost unnoticeable, dangerous smile formed on her lips. Let the show begin. The heavy, carved cathedral doors swung wide open, and the entire, massive room instantly fell completely silent. Every single guest turned their heads in unison, swiveling toward her, their eyes widening with pure admiration and awe. The beautiful bride, poised, a stunning vision in white lace. Ava stepped powerfully forward. Her movements were incredibly slow and highly deliberate. Each step down the long aisle was perfectly measured. She could physically feel the heavy weight of every single gaze in the room. She could hear the hushed, reverent whispers of the crowd. Dylan's arrogant smirk widened significantly as he watched her approach the altar. His head tilted slightly in smug approval, exactly like he was admiring a trophy he had just won. And that's exactly what he foolishly thought she was. A shiny prize. His stupid prize. Ava held his dark gaze, her expression completely soft and entirely unreadable. She let herself pretend, just for a brief, fleeting moment, that she was still the naive woman he thought she was. The adoring, blindly devoted fiancé. The woman so incredibly, desperately in love with him that she wouldn't ever see past his charming, fake facade, past the empty promises, past the horrific betrayal. She let him foolishly believe he had won the game. The older priest cleared his throat loudly, smiling warmly at the couple. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God to celebrate the holy union of. Ava barely even heard the traditional words. Her heartbeat was incredibly steady. Her mind was razor-sharp, intensely focused on exactly what came next. She could feel Jesse's solid presence somewhere directly behind her, standing quietly among the groomsmen, steady, watchful, waiting for the signal. The heavy weight of Dylan's hands still rested comfortably against hers. His fingers were curled possessively around her own, and his thumb traced slow, absent-minded circles on her skin. To absolutely anyone watching in the pews, it must have looked like an incredibly intimate, reassuring gesture of deep love. To Ava, it felt exactly like an iron chain tightening painfully around her wrist. She could physically feel the expectant energy in the room. It was thick with admiration and expectation. The wealthy guests watched with soft, romantic smiles, eagerly waiting for the beautiful, traditional moment when she and Dylan would exchange their vows, seal their love with a kiss, and step happily into their bright future together. If only they knew. She glanced sideways at Dylan, letting herself really, truly look at him one last time. The man she had once deeply loved. The man who had once made her feel so incredibly safe and cherished. The man she had excitedly planned to build an entire life with. Now, looking at his handsome face, all she saw was a pathetic liar. A small man so utterly consumed by his own massive arrogance that he never, not once, considered the terrifying possibility of actually losing. She let a small, almost imperceptible, chilling smile play on her red lips. He was about to lose absolutely everything. The priest lifted his head, his eyes warm and expectant. Ava, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Ava absolutely didn't answer the question. Instead, she slowly and deliberately lifted her free hand into the air. The entire room stilled in confusion. Dylan frowned slightly, shifting his weight uneasily beside her. Ava, he murmured, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. What are you doing? She slowly turned her head, meeting his confused gaze dead on. For a long, agonizing moment, she said absolutely nothing. She just let him sit in the heavy, terrifying silence, in the thick, pulsing tension that had suddenly filled the massive space. Then, finally, she spoke into her microphone. Actually, Ava said, her voice incredibly calm and perfectly measured, echoing through the cathedral. Before I answer that question, there is something I strongly think absolutely everyone in this room should see. Pure confusion flickered wildly across Dylan's face. But before he could say a single word, the massive, expensive LED screens that had been set up behind the altar for a romantic photo montage flickered violently to life. At first, there was absolutely nothing but white static, a brief, jarring moment of distorted, loud sound. Then, the very first image appeared on the massive screens for everyone to see. It was a high-definition photo of Dylan, completely shirtless, lying lazily in a hotel bed. His arm was wrapped intimately around a sleeping woman, who was very clearly not Ava. A massive, collective gasp rippled violently through the packed room. Someone in the front row muttered a quiet, deeply shocked, "Oh my God." Dylan's entire body stiffened like a board. His tight grip on Ava's hand tightened painfully, but she didn't flinch or pull away. Another explicit photo appeared on the screen, then another, and another, each one significantly worse and more damning than the last. Then came the text messages. Huge screenshots of explicit, undeniable texts between them. Can't wait to see you tonight. Wish I was in your bed instead of hers. Ava has absolutely no clue. It's almost too easy to fool her. More loud gasps erupted. Furious whispers grew significantly louder. A massive wave of angry murmurs sweeping rapidly through the shocked crowd. And then came the absolute final, devastating blow. A video file began to play. Dylan's arrogant voice played loudly through the massive cathedral speakers, crystal clear for everyone to hear. Ava, please. She's just a trophy wife. Sweet, devoted, and completely, utterly clueless. The massive room absolutely erupted into chaos. Dylan's mother let out a soft, strangled noise of horror, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth, her face going deathly pale. His father's expression instantly turned to pure, freezing cold disgust. The wealthy guests whispered furiously to each other, some shifting incredibly uncomfortably in their pews, while others openly gaped in shock at the giant screens. Dylan stepped forward, pure panic flickering wildly in his dark eyes. This is completely fake, he shouted quickly, his voice significantly louder than necessary, echoing in the hall. Someone's maliciously trying to set me up with deep fakes. Ava let out a soft, chilling laugh, slowly shaking her head. Really, Dylan? Deepfakes? That's the absolute best excuse you've got. The furious whispers grew even louder. People were turning to one another, murmuring in absolute shock and total disbelief. Dylan's desperation turned significantly sharper. He grabbed her arm. Ava, please, you have to listen to me. Oh, I am absolutely not finished, Ava said coldly, yanking her arm away from his grasp. Silence instantly fell over the room again. Ava deliberately let the horrible moment stretch out. She let him sit sweating in the crushing weight of his public humiliation. Then, she inhaled slowly, deeply, and said the exact words that would completely shatter whatever tiny illusion of control Dylan had left. Oh, and just one more thing, she said into the mic. She let her hand drop gently to rest on her stomach, smoothing it tenderly over the delicate lace of her gown. I am pregnant. A few people in the audience gasped loudly. The shocking news hit the silent room like a sudden, violent gust of wind. Dylan's body jerked backward slightly, his eyes widening in pure shock. You're pregnant? Ava held his terrified gaze. Yes. For a split second, something completely unreadable flickered in Dylan's expression. Hope, maybe? Some desperate, pathetic attempt to leverage the baby to salvage what little control he thought he had left. But then Ava smiled a deadly smile, and the final knife twisted deeply in his gut. But the father, she said, her voice light, almost casual, is absolutely not you. Absolute, dead silence. Not just quiet, but a deep, echoing, hollow silence, as if the entire, massive room had completely forgotten how to breathe. Dylan's mouth parted slightly in shock, but absolutely no sound came out. And then, there was movement behind them. A chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. A tall figure stood up from the groomsman's side. Jesse. His presence was incredibly steady, incredibly calm. And when he finally spoke, his deep voice was crystal clear and completely unwavering. Unlike you, Dylan, Jesse said. His fierce gaze locked entirely onto his brother's pale face. I will actually cherish her. Massive gasps echoed through the church. Dylan staggered backward slightly, looking exactly like he had just been violently, physically struck in the chest. His face went ghostly pale, and his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. You're lying, he yelled at Jesse. Ava didn't blink. Am I? Jesse took a slow, intimidating step forward toward the altar. "I told you once before, Dylan," he murmured, his voice deadly serious. "You absolutely never deserved a woman like her." Dylan's breathing was incredibly uneven now. His entire body tensed violently, exactly like he was on the very verge of snapping. And Ava? She had never, ever felt lighter in her entire life. For a long moment, there was absolutely nothing but silence. Thick, heavy, crushing, suffocating silence. Then, all at once, the intense tension violently snapped. Dylan's handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His hands clenched furiously at his sides, his chest heaving violently. His breathing ragged and loud as his panicked mind scrambled desperately for control, for an escape, for absolutely something, anything, that could magically undo the massive disaster unraveling around him. His wild eyes flicked to the massive screens above them, which were still frozen on the incredibly incriminating texts. Then he looked to his mother, who was staring at him like she didn't even recognize the monster he was. His father's face was completely cold and unreadable, filled with disgust. The hundreds of guests were whispering furiously, their expressions ranging from absolute shock to pure disgust. And then he looked to Jesse. Jesse, standing incredibly tall and completely calm, his broad shoulders squared, looking at his brother with absolutely nothing but quiet, pathetic certainty. Something deep inside Dylan completely snapped. With a loud, animalistic roar of fury, he lunged forward. The movement was incredibly fast and completely reckless. His hands reached violently for Jesse's throat, looking exactly like he wanted to rip his own brother apart with sheer force alone. But Jesse was completely ready for the attack. In a single, incredibly smooth, practiced motion, he expertly sidestepped the lunge, caught Dylan's wrist firmly, and twisted it hard. Dylan let out a sharp, loud grunt of pain as Jesse forcefully wrenched his arm back behind him, sending him stumbling forward off balance. His knee buckled weakly, and before he could even catch himself, Jesse delivered a swift, highly controlled shove directly to his chest. Dylan went crashing violently to the ground. Loud gasps rang out through the entire cathedral. Someone in the pews let out a muffled shriek of horror. The heavy sound of Dylan's body hitting the hard, polished marble floor echoed loudly through the vast space, sharp, brutal, and entirely unforgiving. Jesse didn't even flinch at the sound. He just stood powerfully over his brother, his jaw tight, his dark eyes steady and cold. "Sit down, Dylan," he said coldly. "You've completely embarrassed yourself enough for one day." Dylan groaned in pain, rolling over onto his side, his face burning with absolute, total humiliation. He desperately tried to push himself up off the floor, but his limbs felt incredibly weak. His massive pride was completely shattered beneath the crushing weight of hundreds of judgmental stares boring into him. Then, his father's booming voice cut through the tense air like a sharp knife. "Enough!" Dylan froze on the floor. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. His father, a man who was always perfectly composed, always in total control, was staring down at him with an expression Dylan had absolutely never seen before. It wasn't just disappointment. It wasn't just anger. It was something infinitely worse. Pure, utter disgust. "You have shamed this family enough today," Dylan's father said, his voice incredibly low, even and dangerous. "I will absolutely not allow you to carry our good name in business after this public disgrace." Dylan's stomach twisted violently. "Dad. Wait. You are absolutely no son of mine," the older man spat. The harsh words landed on Dylan like a brutal death sentence. The massive room, already incredibly thick with tension, seemed to rapidly shrink around them. Dylan's breath stuttered in his chest. His vision blurred wildly at the edges. He shook his head quickly, scrambling desperately to his feet, his hands shaking. "No. Dad, you absolutely don't mean that. This is all a huge misunderstanding." His father's disgusted expression didn't change a single fraction. "Get out of my sight." Dylan felt his entire world closing in on him. His powerful father had always backed him financially, had always fiercely defended his actions. No matter what terrible things he did, no matter how ruthless his business choices were. But now he was being publicly cast aside like he was absolute garbage. His mother turned her weeping face away, completely unable to even look at him. His wealthy business associates in the front row were already frantically checking their cell phones. No doubt sending out urgent messages to their offices, severing corporate ties, and rapidly distancing themselves from him before the massive scandal spread further into the stock market. He felt physically sick. Then, a sudden flutter of movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. Brooke. She was nervously inching her way toward the side aisle exit, her shaking hands clutching her expensive purse incredibly tightly, desperately trying to slip away completely unnoticed. But she absolutely wasn't that lucky. A loud, angry voice rang out from the pews. It was one of Dylan's female cousins, her tone incredibly sharp and loudly accusing. "And exactly where do you think you're going, you tramp?" Hundreds of heads turned instantly. The crowd's attention shifted rapidly. Brooke froze dead in her tracks, her beautiful face paling to a ghostly white. I just really need some fresh air," she stammered weakly. Another female guest in the back let out a loud, bitter, mocking laugh. "Oh, honey, you need a lot more than air. You need a literal miracle." A massive ripple of cold, vicious amusement spread rapidly through the judgmental room. Ava watched silently as absolute realization finally settled deep into Brooke's features. She had spent years incredibly carefully crafting her public image as the sweet, trustworthy, innocent best friend. But now all anyone in this room saw was a disgusting liar, a pathetic homewrecker. Brooke's terrified eyes darted desperately to Ava, as if silently begging her to intervene, to do absolutely something to save her. But Ava just tilted her head slightly, her expression completely unreadable and made of ice. Brooke's lips parted slightly, exactly as if she wanted to desperately plead her case, to explain herself. But what could she possibly say that would matter? That she hadn't meant to brutally betray her best friend? That she hadn't planned on sleeping with her best friend's fiancé for months? That it just accidentally happened? Ava didn't care in the slightest for her pathetic excuses, and clearly neither did anyone else in the room. Because before Brooke could even open her mouth to speak, another wealthy guest muttered loudly, "Disgusting trash." Then another echoed the sentiment. The furious whispers grew significantly louder, swirling violently around her, thick with heavy judgment and absolute disgust. Brooke's breath came out in short, shaky gasps. She turned desperately to Dylan, looking at him like he was somehow still her only lifeline in the storm, the one single person who would bravely take her side. But Dylan wasn't even looking at her. He was still standing frozen in place at the altar, his shoulders incredibly tense, his face totally blank with shock. Brooke swallowed hard, the terrible realization hitting her like a physical slap across the face. He absolutely wasn't going to defend her. The man she had risked her entire reputation and her best friend for wasn't going to risk a single thing to save her. Dylan was already entirely focused on thinking about himself, about his own financial survival. And she was nothing but disposable collateral damage to him. Brooke let out a choked, pathetic sob before quickly turning on her heel, aggressively shoving past the angry crowd and completely disappearing through the heavy side door. Absolutely no one tried to stop her. No one cared that she left. And just like that, she was entirely gone from Ava's life forever. Dylan stood entirely alone in the massive wreckage of his very own making. The crushing weight of it all finally settled fully onto his broad shoulders. The professional respect he had spent years carefully cultivating was completely gone. His wealthy family's financial support was gone. His corporate power was entirely gone. And Ava, she was still standing incredibly tall at the altar. Her delicate veil was slightly askew, her beautiful bouquet still clutched firmly in her hands. Dylan finally forced himself to look directly at her. There was something incredibly desperate and pathetic in his expression. "Ava," he started, his voice rough and broken. She smiled at him. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't a mockingly vicious smile. It was just a simple, peaceful smile, exactly like she had already completely moved on with her life, like he was already entirely forgotten. Dylan felt absolutely everything inside his chest crumble into dust. The silence that followed the chaos was incredibly different now. It wasn't the sharp, stunned, horrified kind of silence that had filled the cathedral mere moments ago when Dylan's massive betrayal was first exposed on the screens. The older priest stood incredibly awkwardly at the altar, shifting his weight slightly from foot to foot as he cleared his throat loudly. His confused eyes flicked nervously back and forth between Ava, who was still standing radiantly in her beautiful wedding gown, and Dylan, who was still entirely frozen in place, watching his entire world actively crumble around him. The angry murmurs in the audience had slowly died down to a hush, but the incredibly heavy weight of 1,000 unsaid words still hung thick in the air. Then, finally, the bewildered priest spoke into the microphone, his voice incredibly hesitant and highly uncertain. Do we continue with this wedding ceremony?" Ava let out a soft, releasing breath, barely realizing she had been holding it in. She had executed her plan perfectly, but there was still one very important thing left to do. "Jesse." She turned her body slightly, her gaze immediately finding him standing among the groomsmen. He hadn't moved an inch, hadn't spoken a word since the fight, but his strong presence was as incredibly steady as ever. His hands were still casually tucked into his pockets, his jaw tight, his dark eyes locked entirely onto hers with an intense expression she couldn't quite name. Then, exactly as if making a massive decision in real time, he took a slow step forward out of the line, and then another. Ava's heart stuttered in her chest. The air between them violently shifted, crackling brightly with something incredibly powerful and entirely unspoken. Jesse didn't stop walking until he was standing right directly in front of her at the altar. He looked deeply into her eyes for a long, silent moment. His handsome expression was completely unreadable, exactly like he was desperately searching for something hidden deep in her soul. Then, incredibly slowly, he dropped gracefully down to one knee. A massive, collective gasp rippled wildly through the shocked crowd. Ava's breath caught painfully in her throat. Jesse reached up and took her hand softly, his grip incredibly warm and grounding. "Marry me." Except it wasn't a question at all. It wasn't even a desperate plea. It was a firm, absolute promise, a profound declaration. Ava's fingers curled tightly around his instinctively, her pulse hammering incredibly loudly in her ears. She felt exactly like the solid ground had violently tilted beneath her feet, like the entire world had magically shifted on its axis. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice barely there. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, slow and deliberate. "I know this absolutely isn't how it was originally supposed to happen today," he said, his voice low, quiet enough that only she could hear the intimacy. "And I know you probably weren't expecting this at all." He glanced up at her, his dark eyes completely unwavering. "But you absolutely deserve so much more than what Dylan ever gave you. You completely deserve someone who will proudly stand by you. Someone who will never, ever betray you. Someone who will love you the exact way you truly deserve to be loved." Ava felt her throat tighten with overwhelming emotion. Jesse's large hand squeezed hers gently, grounding her in reality. "I absolutely won't ever hurt you like you did," he continued, his voice fierce with promise. "I won't ever lie to you. I won't ever use you. I will spend every single day of the rest of my life proving to you that you are absolutely not a prize to be won, but a beautiful woman to be cherished." Ava's vision blurred slightly with hot, happy tears. She had spent so much agonizing time feeling like a total fool, feeling used, feeling entirely discarded. She had spent endless, sleepless nights crying, desperately wondering if she had ever really been truly loved by anyone at all. But standing right here, looking down into the eyes of Jesse, the man who had stood so fiercely by her side through all of this chaos, she suddenly realized something profound. He had always seen her clearly, not as a convenient trophy, not as someone weak to manipulate, just her. Her lips parted slightly, her heart pounding furiously. But before she could say anything to him, a bitter, broken, angry voice cut violently through the silence. "You have got to be absolutely kidding me." It was Dylan. He was still standing there, completely disheveled and utterly humiliated in front of his peers. But now his expression was violently twisted with something else, pure, unadulterated rage. His laugh was sharp, loud, and entirely humorless. "This is some kind of sick joke, right? You actually think this pathetic stunt changes anything?" Jesse didn't even turn his head to look at him. His eyes remained locked fiercely onto Ava's, exactly as if Dylan absolutely didn't exist anymore. As if absolutely nothing else in the massive room mattered but her. And Ava. She felt something massive and permanent shift deep inside her soul. For so incredibly long, she had been desperately looking for closure, looking for some grand, theatrical moment where she would finally feel like she had truly won the war. But she realized in that moment that she absolutely didn't need any more revenge. Because Dylan had already completely, spectacularly lost everything. She squeezed Jesse's warm hand back tightly, steadying herself. And then, completely without hesitating, without looking back at her past for a single second, she nodded her head. Yes. The massive cathedral absolutely erupted. Loud gasps, enthusiastic shouts, and wildly excited murmurs swept rapidly through the crowd. Jesse's lips parted slightly in shock, exactly like he hadn't fully expected her to actually say yes to him. But then, his handsome face broke into a slow, absolutely breathtaking smile. It was the exact kind of genuine, pure smile she had absolutely never seen on Dylan's face. The kind of smile that actually meant something profound. He stood up proudly, his grip still firm and warm in hers, his strong presence completely unwavering. The older priest, who had very clearly never dealt with a chaotic situation like this in his entire career, cleared his throat loudly again into the microphone. "Well then, shall we continue the ceremony?" Ava exhaled softly, turning her body back toward the altar. She glanced briefly back down the long aisle. She saw the guests still gaping openly at her, at Dylan, at Jesse. She clearly saw the completely stunned faces of Dylan's disgraced parents. She saw the harsh, judgmental stares from the business elites. She saw the sharp, glowing gleam of 100 cell phones eagerly recording every single second of this insane moment. Then she turned back to Jesse and smiled radiantly. "Yes," she said again, her voice incredibly strong and confident this time. "Let's continue." Dylan let out a strangled, pathetic sound, exactly like he was about to shout something else. But his father's freezing, cold stare completely shut him down before he could even open his mouth. And just like that, the priest straightened his shoulders professionally and began the vows again. This time, when Ava looked into the groom's eyes and confidently said, "I do," she absolutely, truly meant it with her whole heart. Jesse gently slid the wedding ring onto Ava's finger. His touch was incredibly lingering, warm, and wonderfully steady. The immense weight of the beautiful moment settled deeply between them, completely raw and utterly unshakable. The priest, still looking slightly stunned by the turn of events, cleared his throat loudly once more. "You may now officially kiss the bride." Ava barely had a single second to react before Jesse cupped her face incredibly gently in his hands. His hands were perfectly steady, exactly as if this moment had always been entirely meant to happen. His touch was warm and incredibly grounding, absolutely nothing like the cold, highly calculated way Dylan had once held her like a possession. He hesitated for just a tiny, respectful second, almost like he was giving her the absolute chance to pull away if she wanted to, like he desperately wanted this to be entirely her choice. But she absolutely didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him happily. The exact moment their lips finally met, the chaotic world around them completely disappeared. The loud gasps, the frantic whispers, the heavy weight of 100 staring eyes, all of it faded entirely into absolute nothingness. Jesse kissed her passionately, like it was a deep promise, like a solemn vow that went infinitely deeper than any spoken words. And for the very first time in a very long time, Ava wasn't thinking about the painful past. She absolutely wasn't thinking about Dylan, about his cruel betrayal, or about her pain. She was entirely focused on thinking about this perfect moment, about the beautiful way Jesse's strong hands held her like she was something incredibly precious to him, about the quiet, fierce intensity behind the way his lips moved against hers, firm but careful, deep but incredibly patient, exactly as if he was thoroughly savoring every single second with her. When they finally, reluctantly pulled apart, Jesse rested his forehead gently against hers, his warm breath fanning against her skin. Ava's heart pounded wildly in her chest, but she absolutely wasn't nervous anymore. She was entirely, completely sure. A slow, knowing, incredibly handsome smile tugged at the corner of Jesse's lips. "You're completely stuck with me now," he murmured softly. Ava let out a soft, joyous laugh, the very first real, completely genuine laugh she had felt bubbling up from her chest in what seemed like forever. "Good," she whispered back happily. And as the massive room erupted into loud, supportive cheers, as Jesse lovingly laced his fingers completely through hers and pulled her close to his side again, Ava finally knew deep in her soul that this was exactly where she was always meant to be. The lavish reception later that night was beautifully bathed in warm, golden light. The soft, romantic glow of thousands of fairy lights strung gracefully between the large oak trees cast absolutely everything in a warm, dreamlike, magical haze. Joyous laughter and upbeat music filled the cool night air, blending seamlessly with the constant clinking of expensive champagne glasses and the happy, distant hum of lively conversation. The entire night was incredibly alive, completely full of joyous celebration, of whispered, heartfelt congratulations, of stolen, romantic glances, and of beautiful new beginnings. And yet, standing entirely alone in the cold shadows just beyond the warm reach of the fairy lights, Dylan felt absolutely nothing but crushing, suffocating emptiness. He watched miserably as Ava moved gracefully across the dance floor. Her stunning gown caught the light beautifully, her laughter was soft and effortless. She looked absolutely radiant, glowing with a pure happiness in a way he had absolutely never seen before when she was with him. And standing right beside her was Jesse. His hand rested securely and protectively on Ava's waist. His touch was incredibly gentle but absolutely certain, exactly like he had always belonged right there by her side, like he always would. They swayed together on the dance floor perfectly in sync, completely lost in a beautiful world that absolutely no longer included him in any way. Dylan's trembling fingers curled into tight fists at his sides in the dark. This absolutely wasn't how tonight was supposed to be. Out on the dance floor, Ava let out a soft, happy sigh as she rested her head gently against Jesse's broad shoulder. The steady, comforting rhythm of their slow sway made her feel incredibly weightless and free. She exhaled slowly, pulling back just a bit to study his face, really truly studying him. There was something entirely different about the way he was looking at her now. Something incredibly familiar, yet entirely wonderfully new. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a soft whisper. Jesse raised a curious eyebrow, smiling down at her. "How long what? How long have you actually felt this way about me?" Jesse didn't even hesitate for a second. "Since the very first time you actually laughed at one of my terrible jokes." Ava let out an amused, breathy laugh. "Jesse, you literally always make terrible jokes." "Exactly," he said, grinning a wide, boyish grin. and you're the absolute only one who ever actually laughed at them." She rolled her eyes playfully at him, but felt a massive, radiating warmth spread happily through her chest. "That's definitely not true." "Oh, it absolutely is," he said, dramatically dipping her slightly backwards before pulling her smoothly back up into his arms. "I used to constantly test my bad jokes out on Dylan first, just to see if I had a shot at being funny." Ava bit her lower lip hard to keep from smiling too widely. Jessie scoffed playfully. He'd just give me that incredibly arrogant, deadpan look and say, "Jesus, Jessie, is this exactly why Mom still asks if you have a real job yet?" Ava laughed loudly, the sound incredibly light and genuinely happy. "That honestly sounds exactly like him." Jessie smirked, his warm fingers grazing gently over her bare back in slow, lazy, comforting circles. "You want to know something else?" "What?" "You made it really, really hard for me to actually hate him sometimes." Ava arched a highly skeptical eyebrow. "Hate him? Why?" Jessie nodded slowly, tilting his head as he studied her beautiful face intently. "You were always so damn fiercely loyal to him. You were always defending his bad behavior. Always looking at him like he was the absolute best thing in the entire world. It was incredibly frustrating for me to watch." Ava swallowed hard, her heart fluttering. "Why was it frustrating?" "Because," Jessie said, gently brushing a stray, dark curl away from her face, his voice dropping low, "I desperately wanted to be the one you looked at exactly like that." Ava's breath caught sharply in her throat. For a long moment, she absolutely couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but let those incredibly profound words settle warmly over her soul. Jessie must have noticed her shock, because his confident smirk softened beautifully into something else entirely. Something much deeper. Something incredibly patient. He purposely let the quiet silence stretch comfortably between them, exactly as if he were giving her all the time she needed to fully process what he had just admitted to her. And Ava, she didn't need any more time. She already knew the answer. Maybe she had been completely, foolishly blind to his love before, but now she saw absolutely everything with perfect clarity. Ava exhaled softly, tilting her head up to meet his intense gaze. "You absolutely don't have to just wish for that anymore, Jessie." Jessie stilled completely, staring at her, and then ever so slowly a slow, absolutely breathtaking, genuine smile spread brightly across his handsome face. "Yeah," he murmured softly. Ava nodded happily, her fingers curling tightly around the lapel of his tailored suit. "Yeah." Jessie let out a soft, relieved breath, his warm forehead pressing lightly and affectionately against hers. "Guess I finally told a joke actually worth laughing at," he whispered happily. Ava laughed softly, happily shaking her head at his silliness. "Shut up and just dance with me, Jessie." And as he twirled her beautifully under the warm, golden glow of the fairy lights, as her pure laughter mixed perfectly with his deep chuckle, as they swayed happily together in a beautiful new world that was finally entirely theirs, Dylan, watching miserably and completely alone from the cold, dark shadows, finally realized a profound, devastating truth. Some brutal betrayals absolutely shatter you into pieces. But others, they completely set you free. So there you have it, everyone. The story comes to an end, and if you've stuck with me until this very moment, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It truly means that something inside this story connected with you. Maybe it was the pain of betrayal, or the incredible strength it takes to finally stand up for yourself and reclaim your power. Life has a funny way of throwing us into situations that completely break us down, but as we saw with Ava, it's those very moments that forge us into someone infinitely stronger and more resilient. You are always allowed to walk away from toxic situations to protect your peace, and to build a life that actually makes you happy. If this dramatic journey of heartbreak and ultimate triumph resonated with you, Please consider hitting that like button. It really helps support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who might need a reminder of their own incredible worth today. And of course, please subscribe so you never miss another story. We have so many more incredible tales of love, revenge, and redemption coming your way. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, you are the author of your own story. Make it a great one.